Margaret Ellison had built Ellison and Sons from nothing, from a small fabric dyeing shop in Cincinnati that smelled of indigo and ambition, into a textile empire worth $40 million, with contracts spanning 5 states and a reputation that took 3 decades to earn. She had done it with cracked hands and sleepless nights, with decisions made at kitchen tables before the sun came up, with a stubbornness that people called difficult until they called it visionary. She had 2 sons, Gerald and Preston, and she had poured everything into them, their education, their confidence, their corner offices, because she believed that family and business were the same sacred thing. But the board meeting on that cold February morning taught her that she was wrong. Gerald stood first, straightening his Italian suit jacket, and announced with practiced calm that the board had unanimously decided it was time for fresh leadership. Preston did not even look at her. The resolution had already been printed. Her signature was not required. At 67 years old, Margaret Ellison was voted out of the company she had built with her own hands, escorted to the elevator by an HR assistant who could barely meet her eyes, and driven home in silence while her sons held a celebratory lunch with the new investors. She sat in her kitchen that afternoon holding a cup of tea that went cold, and she did not cry. Not because she was not broken, but because she had survived harder mornings than this one. What Gerald and Preston had never bothered to understand, because they had never bothered to pay attention, was that Margaret had a niece. Her name was Clara Voss, and she was 31 years old, quiet in the way that deep rivers are quiet, and she had spent the last 4 years working in the company's logistics division, under a name that nobody connected to the founding family, because her mother, Margaret's younger sister, had moved to Portland and raised Clara far from the drama of the Ellison name. Clara had watched everything. She had watched the supply chain bleed money, because Gerald refused to modernize the warehouse systems. She had watched Preston alienate 3 of their oldest client accounts with his arrogance. She had built spreadsheets in her own time that showed exactly where the company was losing ground and exactly how to stop it. She had sent 2 memos to the executive floor. Neither was ever acknowledged. The morning after Margaret was removed, Clara called her aunt, not to offer sympathy, though she had plenty of that, but to ask a single question. "Aunt Margaret," she said, "do you still hold your 40% ownership stake?" There was a long pause on the line. Then Margaret said, "Yes, they forgot to ask for it." What followed was quiet and precise and absolutely devastating for Gerald and Preston. Clara had already done her research. She knew that a 40% stakeholder, under the company's original charter, retained the right to call an emergency board review if she could demonstrate financial mismanagement, and Clara had 4 years of documented evidence that she had been building without anyone ever asking her to. She hired a lawyer with Margaret's blessing. She presented the evidence to 2 independent board members who had privately grown, uncomfortable with the direction Gerald was taking. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply laid the truth on the table the way her aunt had once laid fabric samples, carefully, deliberately, without a single wasted motion. Within 6 weeks, the board voted again. This time, the result was different. Gerald and Preston retained their positions on paper, but operational authority was restructured. Clara Voss was appointed Chief Operating Officer, a role that had been quietly vacant for 2 years, because neither son wanted anyone competent enough to show them up sitting that close to the top. Margaret was offered reinstatement as chairwoman, a position she accepted with a composure that made Gerald's face go pale. On her first day back, Clara walked through the warehouse she had worked in for 4 years, past the same forklift operators, who had learned not to make eye contact with executives, and she stopped to speak to each of them by name, because she knew their names, had always known their names. She did not redesign the company in a flash of drama. She fixed the systems. She repaired the client relationships. She called the vendors personally and apologized for the last 2 years. She built something more durable than a coup. She built a company that worked again. Margaret watched from her new office and felt something she had not expected. Not vindication exactly, but recognition. She had always known that quiet people were not invisible. They were simply waiting for the room to go still enough to hear them. If this story moved something in you, Remember that kindness is never wasted. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner Stories, where every story reminds us that the most powerful people in the room are often the ones nobody thought to watch.